Welcome to the KISSBCP webinar series, where we discuss all things that relate to no building scenarios, to no people scenarios, no third-party supplier scenarios, and lastly, no systems, all combined to create Chaos the Dragon, which is battled by King Phoenix and his shield.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Don Brennan with Continuity Insights, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Make Sure Your BCP is Flexible, which will be presented by Tam Williams of Kingsbridge BCP. If you're trying to make your BCP practical and easy to follow while keeping it flexible enough to respond to any scenario that threatens your business, then today's webinar will give you the tools you need to incorporate flexibility into your BCP. Throughout the presentation, you will learn how to ensure that your practical needs are met while at the same time adhering to industry standards and best practices, all while preparing for every possible threat. Before we get started, I would like to review a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. By default, you have joined this presentation listening through your computer speakers. However, if you prefer to join using your phone, just select Audio in your control panel, click Phone Call, and the dial-in and access code information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing into the Questions pane of your control panel today as well. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them at the end of today's broadcast. In addition, if you feel that your question may require a more detailed explanation than can adequately be covered here, be sure to email Tam Williams with your question and she will respond to you directly. Today's webinar will also be recorded for later on-demand viewing, and as a registered participant, you will receive a link to this recording. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Tam Williams. Tam is a skilled and experienced business continuity consultant working with Kingsbridge BCP. She has honed her skills over the past 2 decades in a number of industries, including healthcare, research, information technology, manufacturing, and finance. During that time, she has facilitated business continuity workshops and delivered presentations at a number of business continuity conferences throughout North America and is excited to be joining us for today's presentation. Please welcome Tam Williams.
Thanks, Don. Good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good morning for some of you, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for attending today's webinar to discuss an area of business continuity that can be particularly challenging, and that is building and maintaining a business continuity plan and a business continuity management program that meets your regulatory requirements, as well as the needs of your organization, yet it's still easy to follow and flexible enough to respond to any disaster. And some of those disasters may change and evolve themselves as the situation unfolds. Before I jump into today's content, let me first just tell you a little bit about today's sponsor and the company I work for, Kingsbridge BCP. We are now primarily a software company that has been operating in the BCP space since 1983. We have a suite of online business continuity planning solutions that include integrated communication tools and mobile apps. We also provide a range of professional services. We write business continuity plans. We provide on-site training where we share our plan writing methodology. And we perform tabletop exercises, gap analyses, and plan audits. So let's take a look at today's agenda. We're going to start with defining what we mean by flexibility, and then we'll talk a little bit about flexibility through the phases, right from plan development all the way through to plan execution and plan maintenance. And as Don mentioned, we've allowed some time at the end for questions, which you can submit through the chat window, and then we'll address those at the end. So let's start with by flexibility. While sometimes we may feel stretched to the max when developing and maintaining our plans, and particularly when responding to a situation, this webinar will not be about helping you touch your toes. What we really want to talk about here is how to make your plans and programs dynamic and agile in what is a very unpredictable world. The situation we're in today is a perfect example of just how unpredictable our world can be. Many would say that a pandemic was bound to happen, that our history with other viruses dictated that it was just a matter of time before we had another SARS or H1N1 on our hands. However, I think we can probably all agree that this particular pandemic has not been very much like SARS or H1N1, or at least the first SARS. The scale of the worldwide impact was definitely not predicted. It was just one possible end result of a number of possible endpoints. We're dealing with a lot of unknowns, hence the term novel coronavirus. No one was able to predict what kind of transmission rate to expect, how varied the international response would be, how varied the resulting impact on businesses has been and will be, and what the new normal is really going to look like. Just like we don't know when the next earthquake will happen, how big it will be, where the epicenter will be located, and just how severe the damage will be. So we can't predict everything, which means we also can't rely on a single strategy to address a particular scenario, or else we may find ourselves scrambling when we can't execute on that strategy. There is a bit of a tendency I find in our industry to do what I call a bit of ambulance chasing, where we put all of our focus on whatever the most recent threat was to our business, at the risk of ignoring all the others. And even during this unprecedented time, we're seeing companies having to deal with more than just the direct impacts of COVID-19. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were facilitating a debrief with a client who, prior to COVID-19, had a very strong work in the office policy. Despite this policy, the social distancing requirement of COVID-19 forced their hand, and they managed to get 90% of their employees working from home, with only those lacking internet or with really heavily paper-based responsibilities like managing the mail remaining in the office. And the transition went remarkably well for them, and they were feeling really comfortable that all was going better than expected. Then one of their vendors experienced a ransomware attack and was unavailable for a period of time. Then heavy storms came through and knocked out power to a significant number of employees who were supposed to be working from home now. Contact center agents couldn't answer phones, so additional strategies had to be employed to manage the call volume. Once they got power restored to almost all of their employees, they thought they were out of the woods, and then the IT office area experienced a flood. Luckily, there was minimal damage to anything critical, but it did require securing a vendor and equipment to begin the drying process and the relocation of those employees who were working in the area to other office spaces. And this isn't our only client that has had to manage disaster on top of disaster. We need to remain vigilant and ready to tackle new issues as they arise. Disasters, unfortunately, don't come in discrete packages. Now, I don't know about you, we've talked a lot about COVID-19 now, but I've been making efforts in the last few weeks to put myself on a bit of a pandemic diet, not to deal with the quarantine 15 that some have been moaning about, but more just to balance my intake of information a little better and avoid that ambulance chasing tendency that is so common in our industry. So all that to say that I'm going to be bringing up examples today that aren't exclusively related to today's pandemic. I think we need to be thinking more broadly so that we don't expose ourselves to other threats as a result of our hyper focus on the current situation we may be in. In today's presentation, we're going to talk about 3 different types of flexibility as we walk through the basics of the business continuity planning process, from the threat risk assessment all the way through to plan maintenance. We'll talk about how to be more flexible when approaching the design of your plan. We'll discuss how to build flexibility into the resources that are a part of your plan, both those documented in your plan and those that you rely on outside of your plan, such as third-party providers that will support your plan's flexibility. And we'll speak to flexibility in the plan's execution to allow you to not only pivot and respond as situations evolve so that your plan doesn't fail when your primary recovery strategy that you've selected fails, but also flexibility in executing the training and maintenance of your plan so that you can get that job done efficiently and effectively. I think we can all agree that business continuity is not an area where many companies relish spending their resources. So we always need to think about how we can do more with less. So let's start at the beginning with the threat risk assessment. From the perspective of risk mitigation, the threat risk assessment is incredibly valuable. Knowing the threats that are most likely to impact your business allows you to put steps and resources in place in advance of a disaster to reduce the impact of those identified threats and the potential need to activate your BCP at all. Most regulations and best practices will certainly be looking to ensure that this has taken place. However, when it comes to actually developing your plan, many organizations can get very bogged down in scenario-based planning. Their plans can grow to monstrosities that are both difficult to follow and resource-intensive to maintain, particularly when content starts to get duplicated across scenario responses. Whether it's a flood or a fire that takes out your server room, your response steps are actually going to be startlingly similar. A scenario-based plan can also leave your organization with a gap as to how to respond when an unanticipated threat strikes. And we've seen lots of these unanticipated threats stop a company in its tracks, at least temporarily. A large insurance company client that we had lost all connectivity with the outside world, but everything internally was working just fine. Their internet provider detected no issues at all. And it took almost a full day just to figure out that a rat had chewed through a data line in the basement of their building. The same company had to evacuate their building just months later when it filled with smoke. They thought, well, we must certainly have a fire somewhere in the building, yet they could find no evidence. And with everyone eventually evacuated from the building and work disrupted, they discovered their HVAC system was simply sucking in the smoke from an actual fire that was taking place blocks away. So when it comes to writing your plan, a more flexible way to think about the threats to your organization may be to think about the potential results. And if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard me talk about this. The four main result categories of no building, no people, no systems, or no third-party suppliers. So regardless of the threat, you will be more than likely left with one or more of these four results. Structuring your plan to cover these scenarios should leave your company in a pretty strong position then to respond to just about any threat that comes your way. Again, this is not to say that we don't want to prepare for the most likely threats to your business. If we are in a tornado alley, we are going to want to have mitigation steps in place to reduce the damage and protect the health and safety of our staff when we know a tornado is forecasted. But ultimately, if you are impacted by that tornado, it has the potential to take out all or part of your building, drastically reduce your available workforce, knock out your IT systems or connections to those systems, and impair some of the third-party vendors that you rely on to conduct business. So your plan still needs to address those four areas. Moving on to the BIA, this can be a daunting task to tackle. Well, it's important that your BIA is thorough. It's also too tempting to go to a very detailed third-party template you're sure will tick all the regulatory compliance boxes. The comprehensive can often leave you with a lot of pushback from the business areas responsible for completing them, complaining that they just don't have time. They're confused about the BCP lingo these templates tend to contain. And you end up with so much information. Once the templates are completed, you're overwhelmed with what to do next. When approaching the BIA, you need to be flexible in your thinking. Completing the BIA is not strictly to tick a box. It can actually be a very valuable resource that can make the rest of your BCP development go more smoothly. So you really need to ask yourself, what do I really need to know from my business units at the end of the BIA process? What impacts are important to my organization when it comes to determining which business processes are critical to get back up and running first, second, and third? What information can I easily collect from the business units through this process that will make building the plan easier for me? So, for example, it may not be important to rank the impact to third-party suppliers when a business process is interrupted if your business doesn't have very many suppliers. It may be better to focus on the financial impact or the impact to customers or the impact to reputation. It's probably not also worthwhile asking a paperless manufacturing floor if they could reproduce any critical paper records that were lost in a disaster. This may be a waste of time for them, but it might be worthwhile asking if they have already documented an alternate or workaround procedures for the process in question when automation or systems are temporarily not available. If these workaround procedures exist, you have a place to start when evaluating recovery strategies for this group, and you can start your conversation there when it comes to building their plan. Now, before you even start writing your business continuity plan, you need to ask yourself how the people that need to use the plan will actually access the plan. Even the best business continuity plan in the world is of no use if those that need to access it are unable to do so. Your auditor may think you have an excellent plan, but that doesn't mean it's practical to use in a disaster. For the most part, we're seeing an end to the giant BCP binder that takes down a small forest and hundreds of man-hours to complete a single update, not to mention the time it takes to retrieve all those old versions that might be tucked in people's homes in the trunks of their cars or some old bookshelf they've forgotten about. Most companies are now maintaining digital plans, a single source of truth that everyone can access so that the most updated content is always at the ready. Always at the ready, that is, as long as the integrity of the system that hosts that single source is safeguarded. BCP on company networks are often cause for concern. Planners may take comfort in the words that our SharePoint is in the cloud and therefore storing our BCP there is safe. However, on more than one occasion, we discovered that the authentication point to access that SharePoint site is hosted locally and not actually backed up. So if the local server room goes down, that plan is still safely stored on the SharePoint site, but no one can actually access it. Additionally, there are challenges with accessing a hosted solution when internet connectivity becomes flaky. The BCP is a critical resource during a disaster, so we need to build flexibility into accessing that resource. A well-protected hosted solution, either on your network or on someone else's, is fine, but consider a solution that will also provide you with a local copy. Our Kingsbridge sealed solution, for example, is hosted on a secure site that syncs with a mobile app, putting a local copy of the plan on your mobile device so that those involved in the response and recovery have copies on their phones and tablets, accessible even without any connectivity, cellular or Wi-Fi. And yes, even those BCP binders, they're properly maintained and strategically located, are fine as a tertiary solution. The idea here is to think about flexibility and how people need to access this critical resource. Now, you've thought about how your teams will access the recovery plan, but before you get too far along in developing your BCP, you should already be thinking about what tools you can use to help you in writing and maintaining your plan. Many companies have moved away from Word documents now. Well, on the surface, they seem like a very simple way to put all of your business continuity information together. When it comes to plan maintenance and actually using the plan, that initial simplicity can come back to haunt you, as you are eventually buried in hundreds of pages of information, some of which changes frequently and some of which will hardly ever change at all. Teams start to complain that they can't find anything in their plans. Tabletop exercises become painful, and there is a groan of disdain when it comes time to review and update content. On the other hand, we've seen companies spend outrageous amounts of money for a catalog software solution of which they only use a small percentage of the features. While all those features may make a tool seem very flexible, it actually just leaves the users confused as to how to find what they're looking for. We have a client who uses a third-party notification solution. The solution's pretty fancy. You can apply all kinds of filters to select the lists of people you want to send a notification to. It really is quite nice when you know how to use it. The problem is, for this particular company, they find it's too complicated with the number of filters they have to click through, and they can't get rid of the filters. They're hard-coded into the software. We've been performing tabletop exercises with this particular client for 6 years now, and we've never once witnessed them use their notification solution successfully. When it comes to choosing a tool to support your business continuity development and maintenance, beware of all the bells and whistles that may make the software look flexible. Not only do you end up paying for features you'll never use, you may actually end up confusing your end users. Business interruptions bring enough confusion. We don't need to add more through our business continuity tools. Now let's talk about resources. Well, we want to maintain a level of information in our plans that gets the job done while keeping them easy to navigate. We need to ensure there are sufficient resources in your plans to support a flexible response if the situation warrants it. Consider the addition of reference documents for procedures that are not part of your primary recovery strategy, but allow you to more easily pivot when things don't go according to plan. Under the never say never approach, these additional resources could have a significant impact on recovery times. For example, perhaps your business continuity strategy selected for a number of departments during a no building scenario is to leverage an alternate workspace when their primary office location is not available. An incident might occur that shuts down the office, so the alternate workspace option is activated. However, because of the location of the space provided by the vendor and the transportation challenges the disaster has posed, maybe a significant proportion of that workforce can't actually get to this location now. Plan B may be to have some people work from home. But if this alternate strategy was not considered in advance, moving to Plan B may be a challenge. Incorporating work from home procedures as well as instructions for forwarding work phones, etc., as reference documents in your plan allows an easier transition to this alternate strategy. Working from home may not be ideal, and it may not have been the preferred solution, but it can be much more easily implemented if the resources are there and the response teams are aware that this option may need to be leveraged if the primary solution is not. One caution about resources: don't assume what staff might and might not have available to them. Many recovery strategies can look like ideal solutions on the surface, but if the necessary resources aren't in place, problems arise. And working from home again is a perfect example. A lot of you may have experienced this through this pandemic that we've been going through. If this is a strategy you're considering, even if it's not a primary strategy, consider the equipment required. And it's not necessarily just a laptop. Secure tokens or certificates on their computers might be required. They need their bookmarks, passwords, or even old versions of software. Maybe they need a certain version of IE to access a certain website. Even the assumption that those companies with those individuals with company issued cell phones can use those for working from home needs to be validated. One of our clients found that their notification solution just wasn't reaching everyone when they weren't at the office. And a little investigation revealed that half the staff with company issued cell phones actually left them locked in their office desk drawers routinely when they weren't actively traveling for work. So they weren't getting any after hours notifications to those phones. Now, flexibility in resources also speaks to third-party resources, such as the vendors you count on to provide services and supplies to your organization. In February of 2018, some of you may remember 80% of KFC branches around the UK were forced to close because of supply chain failure, costing an estimated £1 million a day. A month later, there were still shortages at some stores, and the company was moving back to their original supplier. Well, this was most definitely a disaster for KFC, and there has been much discussion about the underlying cause and contributing factors. This was a supply chain breakdown, and it may have started with 2 unfortunate car accidents near the supplier's main warehouse. This type of situation should cause us all to pause and think about our own supply chains. Do we have any flexibility built into our current design? If we can't get our resources from supplier A, do we even know of a supplier B that we could approach? How else can we mitigate a supply chain breakdown? Might we need to go to a competitor to help us in the short term in delivering our final product when we can't get raw materials ourselves? Of course, there's been no shortage of similar examples before and during the current pandemic. I'm sure everyone here went looking for toilet paper at one point only to find an empty shelf. Now, there's a lot of different factors that contributed to that situation. However, even before the pandemic was declared, we saw supply chains breaking down when the virus was isolated to China. My husband's laptop had an unfortunate meeting with a leaky water bottle on February 9th. While at the Apple store picking up a replacement, he was told it was in his best interest to choose one off the shelf, as they were making no guarantees as to the delivery date of any custom hardware. This was over a month before the pandemic was officially declared, and it's just one example of how supply chain can be impacted by issues in just one country. Supply chain and vendor management has become increasingly complex and a really important part of business continuity, and one that is often overlooked during plan development. So you need to ensure you're at least aware of alternate vendors. And for the vendors you do have, check that they too have a business continuity plan so that their inflexibility doesn't become your disaster. We have a resource on our website, and I have the link here in the slide, to help you in evaluating not only if your vendor or supplier has a BCP, but also what evidence to look for to indicate that they're not just ticking a box and telling you they have a BCP, but they actually take business continuity seriously. You'll be able to click on that link and get that resource when the slides are circulated after the webinar. So let's move on to flexible execution. While it's tempting to make plans quite prescriptive so that teams can easily follow them, it may be more prudent, depending on your organization, to think of your plan as a series of objectives along with resources, guidelines, and strategies that can be used to achieve those objectives, as opposed to a prescriptive step-by-step approach. For example, when a security breach occurs, IT generally knows something has happened to the network, but they don't know what exactly has been hit. They know they have a primary objective to contain the breach and mitigate damage as quickly as possible, and then to restore service to meet agreed upon recovery time and recovery point objectives. Following guidelines that would be agreed upon in advance, they go about making a series of critical decisions. Do they turn off the one service that they know has been hit, or do they turn everything off? What investigations do they need to perform? And what steps will they take to achieve their objectives following the agreed upon guidelines and the resources they have available? As often happens in a disaster, you don't always have all the information. This pandemic is a perfect example. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. You have to make educated decisions using the information, resources, guidelines, and strategies you have available to you. So your plan needs to ensure that these are all there. The objectives should be clear, along with the guidelines with which they can be achieved, but allow for flexibility in how those objectives are achieved by selecting the most appropriate strategy and using the most appropriate resources for the situation at hand. One client of ours, for example, decided that rather than try to rigidly centralize the purchase, distribution, and setup of computers for staff to use them to work from home should their building be unavailable, all staff were told that if the office is unexpectedly closed, they were to go to Best Buy and purchase a laptop of a minimum designated dollar value to ensure a minimum level of quality. They were then to take the laptop home, leave it in the box until they received additional instructions. If a work from home strategy was required and activated, they would receive instructions to get their new PCs set up. If not, they were to take their receipt and return to Best Buy for a refund. This bought the company time when it came to getting their workforce up and running should a mobile work strategy be required. They used the time of staff that would otherwise have nothing to do to get the hardware they would need to operate. If the hardware wasn't required, there was no cost. All laptops would be returned leveraging Best Buy's return policy. While potentially expensive in the long run, this company decided that a decentralized purchasing strategy was an appropriate, flexible, and low-risk response for a no-building scenario. Another element of flexibility that needs to be considered when speaking of plan execution is knowing when to activate your plan, when to escalate your plan, and when your recovery time objectives might actually need to be adjusted. Well, it's really satisfying to have a clean set of recovery time objectives engraved in stone that you can simply tick off as business continuity or as business processes come back online. Sometimes it's not that simple. In some industries, you may have to incorporate some flexibility when it comes to prioritizing your recovery. Your business continuity plan needs to be flexible enough to respond to the ups and downs of your business's demands. For example, in the health insurance industry, open enrollment season brings a whole new set of priorities compared to other times of the year. For a tax accountant, the weeks leading into the tax filing deadline may have different priorities than the weeks following the deadline. And like this year, when those deadlines get moved, those priorities move with those dates. We've seen how this pandemic has made drastic shifts in market demand, generating unprecedented growth in some sectors, while others are all but failing. The different seasons of your business and the nature of the disaster may drive different thresholds for activating and escalating your plan, and these need to be considered when putting your plan together. While you need to have the resources and infrastructure in place to achieve the recovery time objectives that were deemed acceptable during the writing of your plan, you may find in the moment that you need to adjust those priorities. Internal communications during a disaster can be a challenge for most companies. Traditional methods of communication are typically relied upon. Those typically include phone trees, corporate email, or a commercial notification solution of some sort. Phone trees can be quite impractical for a large organization. They're resource intensive and are prone to break down if a key person within the tree is unavailable. They also rely on phones being available, which may not be the case. Corporate email is another option, but if your email goes down, so does your method of communication. A notification solution is also a great option, but has some limitations in your ability to have a two-way conversation. And depending on the solution you choose, like the example we talked about earlier, they can be complicated. So just like any other recovery strategy, it's important that we don't rely on just one method of communication, but rather provide a few options that will meet our needs. To add even more flexibility to your plan, you can also consider less traditional, but actually historically successful Resources such as social media, private Facebook pages, or private Twitter accounts can provide private two-way communications when other methods may be unavailable or inefficient. No one method of communication will be perfect, but having these alternate strategies in place provides an inexpensive way to pivot in the midst of a disaster when things aren't going entirely according to plan with the communication strategy you had hoped to use from the start. So we've talked about flexibility during the development of your plan and how to build flexibility into the strategies and resources you include in your plan. But what about training? And what about keeping that plan current, the dreaded plan maintenance? Now, training doesn't need to be a formal time set aside strictly for business continuity purposes. Well, this is super helpful and probably prudent when your plan is brand new. With a little more flexible thinking, you can incorporate BCP training into onboarding of new staff, staff meetings, internal newsletters, and other health and safety or security training opportunities. This approach allows for frequent revisiting of your business continuity plan, keeping it front and center on the minds of staff while not bombarding their calendars with more meetings. You may have the best plan in the world, but if staff aren't familiar with how to use it, it won't be any good to anyone. An excellent way to get your staff familiar with your plan, obviously, is through exercising. There are a few strategies you can employ when designing your tabletop exercises to evaluate how flexible your plan is, whether it has the resources necessary to support that flexibility, and how good your teams are with thinking flexibly during the exercise. First, you can try eliminating critical people and/or alpha dog personalities to verify that the rest of the team is sufficiently cross-trained so they can adjust and flex to take on the responsibilities of the missing individuals when disaster strikes. If they are never forced to take a leadership role during a tabletop exercise, we certainly won't have any confidence that they will be able to execute during a disaster. Another strategy is to challenge senior management by incorporating injects into your exercises that force a flexible approach. Develop a scenario that challenges them to pivot when strategy A doesn't pan out and they are forced to move to a secondary option. They need to learn to expect the unexpected, like the alternate work location that seemed to be the perfect place to put the company's call center until it's discovered that regional damage has made the location inaccessible. These exercises will also identify where you may need to identify and document alternate strategies, or where more resources may need to be added to the plan to support a more flexible response. Just keep in mind that these types of exercises I'm describing are a little bit more advanced. They are more challenging and should really be introduced once teams have mastered responding to more basic scenarios when primary recovery strategies remain an option and are followed through to the end. Conducting a challenging tabletop that forces a flexible response too soon for inexperienced participants can really result in frustration, reduced buy-in, and a real lack of trust that the plan will work. These exercises, however, are a great way to challenge the teams and have become quite confident and comfortable in responding to a fairly basic exercise. Flexible thinking when it comes to finding opportunities to exercise your plan can lead to great results without being too resource intensive. One strategy is to leverage emergency response drills to conduct mini exercises. When evacuation drills are conducted, target a few teams to perform a mini exercise, asking them a series of questions like, what would you do if you were now told that you can't re-enter the building? If you were told right now to activate your business continuity plan, how would you access the plan? What would your immediate challenges be in achieving the first few objectives in your plan? And what resources would help you in better achieving those objectives? Just a few minutes during an evacuation drill allows many business continuity exercises to take place without hijacking everyone's calendars for an additional formal tabletop exercise. Other ways of injecting some business continuity preparedness into everyday corporate life is to perform random drills. In some companies, laptops are a key BCP strategy to mitigate the risk of something happening to the company building after hours. Staff are issued laptops with the expectation that they take them home at the end of the day. If the building burns overnight, but systems are still running, working from home becomes a great strategy. However, not everyone enjoys taking their laptop home, so staff can become a little complacent. And before you know it, all those laptops are being left at the office, and the risk of your staff at home with no equipment while your building is in flames becomes more like reality. We were at a client site actually just last year to do some work on their plan when the fire alarm actually went off. It was clearly not a drill, as there were reports of the smell of smoke among those gathered in the parking lot, and the post-event debrief actually identified an issue in one of the kitchens. This particular company has close to 1,000 employees, and one of their primary strategies is actually work from home. And everyone is supposed to have a laptop as a result in order to be able to work from home, most of them using that laptop back and forth between home and work. Well, as my colleague and I stood in the parking lot, from our vantage point, we were the only ones within eyesight that had our laptops in hand. Another strategy to ensure laptops go home is the after-hours late-night laptop audit. This involves going from office to office after everyone has left for the day, collecting up laptops that have left behind and leaving your business card or that of the individual's manager in its place. The employee has no choice the next morning but to complete the walk of shame to the office of the BCP coordinator or their manager to collect their laptop. If the policy is well known, the point is made without even having to exchange any words when the employee shows up to pick up their laptop. Of course, if they never come to pick up their laptop and they're not on PTO, you may have a bigger issue on your hands than a gap in your BCP. Of course, no matter how often you run this drill, you have to expect the unexpected. There will be a certain percentage of employees that still will not have their laptops at home when they need them. And your plan needs to be able to have strategies and resources in place to respond to that need when it arises. A similar strategy can be used to enforce clean desk policies. If it's left on your desk, it gets collected and you'll need to retrieve it from your manager the following morning. You might also consider ways of familiarizing your staff with communication strategies that will be used as part of your BCP. You can use your notification solution to notify staff of fun events, such as a corporate golf tournament, or you can run a competition to see which teams can respond to their notifications the fastest with prizes as a reward. Lastly, one other way to incorporate flexibility into your plan maintenance and exercising is to incorporate BCP into all change management processes in your office. With every new system, new product, new process, new equipment, new position, the question should always be asked, how does this impact our business continuity plan? This performs two valuable functions. First, it provides an opportunity to look at the enterprise impact of an isolated change. One of our clients was looking at making a large investment in generator power for their manufacturing floor. They felt it was important that they could continue manufacturing product to meet their SLAs should there be a disruption in their notoriously unstable power grid. Sounded very logical at the time. However, what was overlooked in this siloed approach was that the warehousing and distribution aspect of getting their product to the customers. Turns out their main warehouse held 3 months worth of product in inventory at any given time, except the warehouse didn't have a generator. Their lift trucks were electric, and some of their products were temperature sensitive. So with an enterprise level lens applied to the problem at hand, and a flexible mindset, management realized that investing in generator backup for their manufacturing floor wasn't going to solve their problem. The second benefit to incorporating BCP thinking into all corporate changes is that small plan updates can occur as corporate changes take place. when information is fresh in everyone's minds. This makes have to annual plan review time really just be a plan review and not a complete plan overhaul. With that, thank you for joining us today. We hope I've left you with some ideas as to how to incorporate flexible thinking, flexible execution, and flexible resources into your business continuity plan and your business continuity management program. So Don, if you're still on the line there, we do have some time for questions, and I'd be happy to answer those now.
Okay, thank you, Tam. I'm right here. And we have a few questions that have come in, so we have some time left when we jump right in. And I just want to remind everybody, you still have time to submit questions for the questions pane in your control panel. And if we do not get to them today, Tam will respond to you and answer them directly. So let's get to our first question. First question, Tim. How do you support flexible recovery time objectives in the middle of a recovery? Is there not potential for causing confusion and departments working in cross purposes?
That's a good question, and one that we often get. There's a few strategies you can use to try and mitigate that risk. You certainly don't want one half of your organization thinking that a certain process is number one priority, and the other half of your organization working on something else because they received a different message. So first, think about seasonality. As I mentioned earlier, for some business processes, there is a season in which some things will be a bigger priority than others. And if that exists in your company, you'll really want to document that clearly in your plan so that everyone knows that certain processes are subject to change based on when the disaster occurs. That way, there's no surprises, and teams should be experiencing. And so when they hear that there's been a shift in a change in priority, they should be expecting that. Second, this emphasizes the need for multiple potential methods of communication so that everyone gets the information they need when recovery directions shift. And lastly, be sure to incorporate these types of shifts as part of your exercising so teams get used to the fact that priorities can change partway through a recovery. Make sure the team managing the response gets some practice executing these shifts and communicating them to the rest of the organization.
Okay, thank you. Our next question deals with flexibility in resources and the supply chain. And the question is, supply chain is a major issue right now. Can you give us some examples of solutions?
Yeah, it is a major issue. We seem to hear about it every day. I'll give you some examples of solutions that folks often don't consider, which is often getting support from a competitor. Now, obviously, you need to keep competition laws in mind. And the pandemic going on, even though people are, doing whatever they can to recover, they do still need to remain compliant with any competition laws in place. But just some simple examples. So financial institutions may rely on the ATM infrastructure of their competitors to provide cash to their clients, and then they just waive the service fees. Credit unions may rely on a shared branching network. Manufacturers may call upon competitors to even just complete a step in their manufacturing process that they're not able to complete themselves. So, for example, they may need to be able to build a basic product, but they don't have the painting resources to get that product painted and out to market. So they may outsource the painting step. Print companies often use this outsourcing method in order to, they actually have a network of competitors they work with all the time in order to meet their SLAs. So just a few examples there about how you can actually use what you may think of as your competitor could be your best friend once there's a business or interruption in place.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, you've spoken about how to make our plans more flexible But what about all the things our auditor?
Yeah, so we have to make sure our plans don't get so kind of loosey-goosey and flexible that they start to raise the eyebrows of those that are reviewing them. We want to keep in mind that we're not asking you to remove anything from your plan that would allow it to meet whatever standard your plan is being asked to meet, whether it be NCUA, ISO, or just best practice. All of that should still be there. What we're asking is that you go a step beyond those rigid requirements and think about how your plan and plan maintenance will actually stand up in the real world. Even if the auditor thinks your plan is great, is it actually meeting the needs of your organization? And are you using it internally through your training and through your exercising in a manner that's really forcing people to think flexibly and a little bit outside the box and a little bit beyond the basic planning requirements to ensure that when bad things happen, they're ready for just about anything.
Okay. We're just about out of time, but we have one more question. We have time for one more question, so why don't we try to answer this one? With the pandemic going on right now, we don't have the time or the bandwidth to spend on our business continuity plans. What should we be doing right now to make the most of the current situation?
Yeah, and I can relate to this. We've been in touch with a lot of our clients and they're like, I'm so swamped. But what the people that were most prepared going into this, what they are most swamped with right now is actually working on their plans. There's nothing like being in a response phase to compare in terms of capturing lessons learned and capturing all the things that are missing from your plan. We actually did this with a client just a few weeks ago. Even though, you know, they're working from home, they're scattered all over the place, they're dealing with day-to-day changes and whatnot, we just met with them and talked about how are things going? What went well getting you moved home? What didn't go well? How have communications been? As busy as everyone is, it's really important to carve out some time to do a little bit of a, I want to say a post-mortem, but it's kind of like a mid-mortem. We're kind of in the middle of this. What went well? What could be better? What can we sustain now for a long period of time in the way that we're working? And what things are at a breaking point with the temporary solutions we've put in place? Basically, how can we take our current plan and flex it to make the next phase a little bit easier and our return to whatever our new normal might look like be a little bit better and smoother. So as much as we want to ignore our plans, or it's tempting to ignore our plans right now, it's like great fodder at this moment for opportunities to gather information that will just make our plans so much better in the future, especially if we're looking at potential second wave of this pandemic. The information you can glean now and incorporate into your plan, all those lessons learned, you'll be able to reap those benefits later.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Tim. Great answer to that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to let everybody know that if you do have questions we didn't get to today, or as I mentioned, if you think of new questions, you can reach out to Pam directly at the email address that's currently shown on the screen. And I want to remind you that we'll also be posting a recording of this webinar on the Continuity Insights website in a few days if you missed any part of today's broadcast. So thank you again, Tam, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Make sure your BCP is flexible. On behalf of Continuity Insights and our corporate sponsor, Kingsbridge BCP, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.